In 1991, Peppermint Candy, directed by Shang-Dong Lee, was released and depicts a story told in reverse chronological order of a man who has committed suicide. In 2010, Incendies, directed by Denis Villeneuve, was released and tells a story of two siblings on a search for their long-lost brother and father, after receiving their mother's will and demands. These two films talk about victims of past trauma and the end result it has on people. Peppermint Candy depicts the life of a victim of societal and governmental pressure during the dictatorship of South Korea. Incendies depicts a victim of conflict during the Lebanese Civil War of 1975. In this video essay, we'll be discussing how these two films use their narrative elements to tell their stories differently, but share the same theme of past trauma. Part 1. Symbolism. Let's begin with Incendies. In the film, the mother of the two twins, Sean and Simon, are given 3 letters. One to their father, who they believe was dead, and one to the brother that they did not know of. The final letter would only be received by the two twins if the 2 other letters were delivered. In their mother's will, they are tasked to find their brother and father somewhere in Eastern Europe, and to fulfill one of her dying wishes. As the film progresses, the siblings are left to uncover their mother's dark past as a political prisoner during the Civil War, which led to her trauma and battered spirit. Throughout their searches, the twins attempt to discover the identities of their father and brother, who they uncovered are shockingly one and the same. In the end, they give the 2 letters to the lost father/brother and fulfill their mother's dying wish. In the letters, the mother confesses her past and shares her story to her first child. As he reads the letter, she writes she loves him and her 2 other children despite all the misfortune and anger brought to her and him. Through her confession of love, she overcomes the trauma that has tormented her all her life and accepts that she and he could have never known of the accident that occurred all those years ago. The explicit meaning of forgiveness. By forgiving her first son for torturing her and violating her, she is able to finally move on from the deep pain and anger she had within her. Forgiveness originates from the Greek word aphiemi, which means to let go or release. In the film, it explicitly refers to how the mother is able to let go of her pain before her death. Peppermint Candy begins with the protagonist, Young-hoo, committing suicide by throwing himself onto the way of a train. For how this story is told, the train is shown every time Young-hoo's past is revealed. Throughout the film, it is told through chapters that depict a part of Young-hoo's life, progressively going further back in time in his life. However, 3 days before he took his life, he met an old fling that used to send him innocent peppermints when he was in the army, now dying from a sickness and wanted to see him again. This old fling represented a key aspect of his life that he could not seem to shake the thought of when he first met her, being someone he wishes to meet again. However, he settles for any woman that may remind him of her. Young-hoo, in the beginning of the film, is an unpleasant and broken man, but at the end of the film, we see that he was not always like this. He too was as innocent as Candy. The implicit meaning of his fall from innocence. 3 days before he took his life, Young-hoo mentions he wishes he can go back and kill whoever is responsible for his life being ruined. Footage of the train is shown being played in reverse at the start of every chapter of his life, much like a train stopping at a station. The train symbolizes his slow descent from innocence, and before any tragedy struck his life. Every chapter of his life is about a significant experience he went through, more often a tragic one, but slowly showing him less filled with sadness and rage. The last chapter is when he was at his most pure and innocent. In the last moments of the film, Young-hoo, despite being at his best, deep down is scared for his future, somewhat foreshadowing what will happen to him. Part 2. The depiction of violence and trauma. In both films, violence is not used for entertainment. It is meant to signify major plot events in the films and always has a significant meaning for the characters and overall narrative. In Peppermint Candy, violence is shown directly. It is to show that Young-hoo is accustomed to violence and torture. By focusing on his facial expressions, we see that he becomes less comfortable hurting others and becomes more traumatized the younger he gets throughout the chapters. And the most important instance of violence, however, would be where he is still not accustomed to violence itself and accidentally shoots an unarmed woman during his time in the army. Interestingly, the shot is shown off-screen, unlike the rest of the violent acts he commits. This action represents his very first act of violence as his worst and his most regretful, contrasting his other on-screen acts and nonchalant behavior to hurting others. For Incendies, the same is applicable. The most important instance of violence would be when the mother, Nawal, is raped in prison off-screen. This scene is important because it is the explanation for Noel's anger and trauma in the film. This moment also sets the emotional reveal that Noel's first child was the one who raped her. However, both did not know until decades later. The only explicit scenes of violence are with firearms. However, the scenes are still relevant for the progression of the plot and aids the audience to understand character motivations and the impact these events had on them. Part 3. The endings. In the ending of both films, it shows the beauty of the main characters has been thoroughly trampled by their love, despite their extremely tragic endings. In Incendies, the letter she wrote for her lost son speaks to how unbreakable and caring her spirit is for her children, which in return makes her journey all the more heartbreaking that she will never be able to see her family as a whole. In an article titled 1 + 1 makes 1 Immobilities in Incendies by Jaron Cohan, he interprets Noel's final words to her twins as a message for the audience as well. To quote, "Your story begins with a promise to break the chain of anger. Thanks to you, I finally kept it." What we can take away from this quote is that past family trauma can leave burdens for the next generation, and that it sometimes requires the children of the victims to be the ones to break the cycle of trauma that has plagued their family. In Peppermint Candy, the last chapter for Young-ho is also heartbreaking due to it being the same location he commits suicide. The scene includes him being at his purest, meeting his first love, Sunam, for the first time. Although, at his best, the scene includes him walking alone under the bridge where he took his own life, at the beginning of the film, shedding a tear as he looks up into the sky, uncertain about his future. Comparing the two endings, Incendies has the ending for Noel being finally able to have closure and being able to die without anger, letting her children know that they will forever be in her heart. For Peppermint Candy, however, Young-ho's ending was never going to conclude with him having reconciled with his past and dying at peace with his trauma. Instead, having him die with rage and self-hatred, having his trauma be too much for him to live on. Both films have tragic endings, but each present the end result of the protagonist's trauma differently. Noel is able to move on from her trauma and die with peace. Young-ho is unable to die at peace and has his trauma overtake and consume him till the point of death. Incendies and Peppermint Candy, while having the same theme of past trauma in their stories, they both present that content differently in their form. So while being similar, the two films will offer different experiences and final results when the credits roll. That is to say, dealing with trauma will have different results for everyone, and how we decide to cope with that trauma will not always be the same for everyone. In Incendies, it was to accept that we cannot change the past and that we should try to forgive or find closure within ourselves. In Peppermint Candy, it was how dealing with our trauma with self-destructive habits can consume us and become too much to bear.